one of the things that I was interested in is kind of combined two of the interests. So for those of you that are thinking about academic careers, I was interested in both regionalism and nationalism. So I grew up really interested in Irish nationalism, independence movements, and I was interested in the EU and what it was doing to domestic politics in the various countries. So a way for me to think about how these two things went together, or whether or not the European Union as a new kind of international organization that doesn't look quite like anything else, how it changed nationalism in Europe. And I'm talking about nationalism like Basque nationalism, Catalan nationalism, not German nationalism or French nationalism, which is a different kind of thing. And one of the things that I'm interested in with this question is why these independence parties, like the Scottish National Party, the Basque National Party, at various points in time, the Convergence and Union Party in Spain, are competing there, but not in southern France, let's say, where the same ethnic groups exist, but there aren't really the same kinds of political parties. So I'm interested in that. At the same time, I kind of grew into interest in these regionalist parties. I became interested in the European Union and the multi-level governance literature, which is a complicated kind of federal. I'm teaching federalism to my undergrads right now. It's like kind of like a federal system where there's a central government in Brussels and the state governments or the individual countries. But then you have this other layer like Scotland or Catalonia, which is not quite like our states. It's a little bit different. And that led to the major research agenda behind here. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about diversity in Europe and explain kind of where these parties exist and where they don't exist, just to give you a little background. I'll talk a little bit about a critical case for me, which is Scotland, which over the last 40 or 50 years has had what's useful for social scientists. They've had multiple votes, actual behavior about whether or not to decentralize or to go independent, which is useful for what I do. And I'll talk a little bit about how niche parties, like the broader party literature, although I won't talk much about that. It's not, with only 30 minutes, I'm going to skip most of that. I'm going to talk about why I think the EU makes these parties more likely, and why it makes these regionalist movements more possible here. And so I'll talk about what I call the Viability Theory, which is just, I'll get to in a minute. And then finally, the big question is, does it matter? Does the EU matter? And I'll talk about that, and then introduce some other things that I'm not going to talk about that you can either read about and buy my book, or you can ask me in Q&A, and I've got slides to show those things too. I'm fine with you guys asking questions as I go along. If there's something unclear, it's supposed to be a conversation. There's people all over the place. I trust that it's not just for the pizza. Some people are interested in Europe, so I will take this as a compliment. This is the shape of my book and kind of a way to think about what I'm doing. I spent a lot of time just defining these parties, explaining who that is, and I'll tell you how I did that in a minute. I spend a chapter talking about the theory for why I expect this relationship. And this is the chapter that I'm going to talk about today, why these parties are successful in some parts of Europe and not in others. And then two other parts, I talk about which regionalists are pro-Europe and which are not, and why. And then I talk about public and what they think about all of this. And that's kind of where I go through it. And again, except for this, everything else you're welcome to ask about in Q&A. I'm happy to talk about it. Just to give a brief, Europe is a lot different than the U.S. In many, many ways. But one of the key ways that makes the EU so hard to govern and unify is the great diversity of peoples and languages. 27 or more official languages, and even within countries, you can see this is just a linguistic map of Europe, and it's more historical language. Obviously, most people in Ireland don't speak Gaelic anymore. Most people in Ireland speak English. But you get different languages in France. You get Euskara in Spain and Catalan, all over. Just to give you a taste of how one of the ways that I measure cultural difference, one of the ways that I think about whether or not I'd expect to see different parties in different parts of Europe is whether or not the people are different than the rest of the country. So for instance, people in some parts, some of the Länder in Germany are not that different than the rest of Germany, and so I'd expect a pretty low difference, whereas Scotland historically is quite different than the rest of England, so I would give them a higher score. I use language as a proxy for that. It's not ideal, but it's there. So the most different place for anybody that knows a lot about languages, Basque is a language that shares no similarities to Spanish or any other Romance or European language, actually. In language family trees, it breaks off at the very first spot that it can. So it's the most different. Catalan, on the other hand, that kind of eastern part of Spain over there, Catalan's not that different than Spanish in linguistic terms, and so that's a lot closer than the Basque, and I think that matches well. Another map, not quite as pretty, but shows just like maybe different peoples, and then this, just to resituate, I'm only talking about Western Europe for the most part, because I wanted to go all the way back to the 50s before the EU established itself, and introducing the Eastern European countries that are different in many ways, and didn't become independent for the most part until the 90s, so it's a different kind of story. I think a lot of what I'm talking about can explain some things in Eastern Europe, and I'm happy to talk about that later. Again, what I'm interested in is why we see movements, sorry I'm bound by a cord here, why we get a movement in this part of Spain, but not that part of France. Why do we get a movement in the 50s in the Danish quadrant of Germany, but not in other parts of Germany, right? So what it is that's going on. And then, as I'll show you later on, why these movements are more popular as time goes on. They become more and more popular all the way up until we see 2 votes for independence last year, one in Catalonia that was unofficial and not quite legal, and one in Scotland that would have created an independent country if it had gone through. So what are these regionalist parties? A lot of people define the parties parties are formed to protect the interest of a group. That's what the regionalist part is. And so it can be an ethnic thing. It doesn't always have to be. It can be language, ethnicity, but it is about geographically concentrated groups. That's a key. It's not that's what separates it a little bit from the U.S., where you do get minorities in the U.S., but they're spread out geographically. They're geographically dispersed, as opposed to in Scotland, like most Scots live in Scotland. Most Welsh people that identify as Welsh people live in Wales. So a couple of things that distinguish these parties, I distinguish them through behavior, how they see themselves. So one is that they have to demand some sort of cultural identity. Often that means language. So for the Welsh play Cymru, they want to make sure that Welsh is on street signs and things like that. So some sort of goal of cultural identity. And sometimes that's as far as it goes. It's just the cultural identity. They actually don't have independence motivations. So a party like the Swedish People's Party in Finland, they're not motivated for independence. I mean, it's a small group in a small part of Finland, but they do want to make sure that they're seeking that recognition of cultural identity to protect their interests. Most of them, actually as part of the definition, they have to demand some form of self-government, right? It does not mean independence, though. That's the difference between regionalist and kind of separatist. So one type is the type I just mentioned, the Swedish People's Party, who are protectionists, who are really out to preserve whatever aspect of cultural identity they see as prominent, like language. Another type is the Plaid Cymru in Wales, who are what the literature calls autonomist, which means they're okay with being part of the UK. They're not angling for independence for the most part. But they do want more power. They want more rights. They want to make more decisions on their own, which I'll explain why in a minute, why that's an important part of it. But the autonomists don't necessarily care about general decentralization. So that's a separation with the national federalist parties like Lega Nord. They want the whole country decentralized. Lega Nord wants to make decisions for the north in Italy, but they also want the south to make more decisions on their own too. They're more broadly decentralized. Plague Cymru doesn't care a bit about whether or not England makes its own decisions or not. England already makes its own decisions, so they don't have to worry about that. England takes care of that themselves. And the last type is the most dramatic type, the one that we think about the most, is the separatists, the ones that actually angle for independence. Those are rare, and if you think more internationally, as you all probably do in Park, that's because the grievances that these parties have are not the same as what you had in South Sudan, right? None of these groups in Europe, with the partial exception maybe the Basque, have a government trying to hunt them down or send militias against them. It's a more peaceful sort of separatism than you see in lots of other parts of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question regarding the difference between national federalists and separatists. I always thought the Lega Nord was for separatism of northern Italy from the main Italian government. I thought that was a separatist movement.
They were at one point when they started in the when Lega Nord formed out of all these different Italian leagues. They were initially separatist, but over time they, as you'll see, they actually compete all over Italy now, and their platform is more federalist than that, and they're more focused on radical right politics, anti-immigration, anti-corruption, those types of things, as opposed to straight separatism. But yeah, Lega Nord, some of these parties are hard to categorize. Lega Nord goes back and forth in lots of ways. Great question. So where do these parties compete? Some map I made, so that's why it's just okay. You get different parts of Europe that are colored that darker blue. Italy's the confusing one because Lega Nord actually does have, this never made sense to me, because I'm not Italian, I guess, but why people in southern Italy vote for a party that specifically says southern Italians are terrible, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but they do get votes all over the country.
Julia knows.
Yeah.
Say it. Julia's from Milan.
I'm Italian.
Sure.
Yeah, it's kind of complicated, as you said. It is at the beginning, like Lega Nord was more for the separation between the north and the south. But right now, the political situation in Italy is very complicated, and people change side very quickly. So that's why in the south, like they see Lega Nord as the one like with that maintains the promises and do the things, no? So that's why they're voting for Lega Nord, even if it is in the south. So it's really complicated.
Yeah, and I think like the easy answer to the complicated part is that they're the party that's most clearly against immigration, and so as you can see in this climate, that's a platform that has an audience anywhere. And so if let's say they tone down some of the anti-Southern rhetoric so that they can instead yell about North Africans, they can get everybody, some parts of people on board. Other than that, you get various parts of Spain over time. You get Scotland, Wales, you get a very short, brief time when there's a movement in Cornwall. The part between Denmark and Germany is the Schleswig-Holstein movement. So you get movements in lots of different places, but also not. So part of the hard thing for me in studying this was figuring out how to get the zeros, basically, where they don't compete, because I need to understand where they don't compete so that I understand, so I can try to explain why they do. So I did this by categorizing using the EU system of regions. Some of these are not actually administrative. Well, they are all technically administrative regions, but a lot of countries, especially like the Scandinavian countries, are centralized. So they're not states the way Länder are, they're not regions the way Scotland are, but they're administrative regions for that. It's the administrative level directly below the country. And these colors are regionalist parties anytime between 1950 and 2010. So they go up and down. In Italy, in Spain, for instance, it starts out in just Basque and Catalonia, and then it spreads. In other parts, they basically start to go away, like there aren't movements in Schleswig-Holstein anymore. Okay. So another way to look at this is the dark line. Let's pay attention to that one. The votes just consistently go up over time, getting up into that 2005-10 when regionalist parties are getting 12 to 15% of the overall vote. Vote share goes up a little bit less, right? As you can imagine, vote share depends on other things, and vote share where the parties competed do have this is a different way to measure this, just where those parties actually contested elections, so discounting all those zeros. You see big spikes, more uncertain, like there's more variation. Part of that in the 74 period is that's when Scotland discovered oil. So the Scottish National Party got a huge boost, and that was a big one. Starting in 1980, you get Spain and Greece coming online, so the votes are different. So Scotland is an easy case for me to talk about. It's a critical case in investigating this relationship, partly because the EU has played a big role in the rhetorical debate between the center and the periphery in this country in particular. So in the 70s, when Scotland finds oil, that's when the Scottish National Party came out and said, okay, we can make it on our own. We have oil, we can be like Norway, we can be rich, we're a small, social democratic country. So they go out and they try to sell this. The people in Scotland were skeptical about this, in part because the No campaign coming from England said basically, if you all leave, we will shut the borders and you won't be able to sell your goods to us anymore. And of course, England, this big economy, is the biggest importer of Scottish goods. So industrial workers were like, I'm not losing my job just so I can fly a different flag. Let's keep things reasonable, right? So the referendum for decentralization failed, right? And in other parts of the book, I explain how even though it was a referendum for decentralization, it was actually a referendum on independence, because people in Scotland thought a vote for devolution was an actual vote for independence, that eventually, if they devolve, they will become independent. That's the thought process in the 70s. So they vote against it then. So how did the SNP combat this over the next 20 years? Because in 97, that same referendum passed, right? So they have 20 years to change the minds of the voters. And the way that they did this is the EU. They used the EU to say, England can't raise its barriers, right? If they did, they'd be breaking EU regulations, right? So the EU itself becomes the new border. So they don't have, the workers didn't have to worry about losing their jobs anymore because of that factor. Now there are other things to worry about if you go independent, right? Who's going to pay the debt? Are they going to be able to do all the other things? There's other issues, but that major argument that workers were scared about goes away. And Scottish elites very much used this. And so in the 80s, Scotland went from being relatively skeptical of the EU to being a big proponent of the EU. And it's the only place actually where there is a strong base for the EU in the United Kingdom. Scottish Member of Parliament Gordon Wilson calls it a first-class way of pushing the advantages of political independence without any threat of economic dislocation. Right? Of course he's a politician. Of course there's actually a threat, right? There's some threat. But that's the kind of argument that they were saying. So he argued that within the common trading umbrella, move to independence can take place easily and smoothly, right? And if you paid attention last year when the Scottish independence referendum happened, that was a key part of the debate. The No campaign went out and said it wouldn't happen smoothly, you wouldn't automatically get into the EU, and if you did get into the EU, you'd have to take the euro, which you really don't want to do. So that was part of the strategy between these two sets of actors. Okay, so that's why in Scotland over time, obviously, has been more and more pro-independence until the most recent election where 45% of people voted for independence, which is virtually unheard of going back to the 70s when people were worried about 20%. So a big change there. So how does this work? There are things about being big. I'm going to try to go quickly through this to get to the empirics. Why was it important for states to be big? So this is kind of 19th century European politics. Why did Germany unite? Why did Italy unite? Why did the UK unite over time? There's a couple of things about being big in the old era that matter. For one thing, you needed a big country so that you could have a big army, so you could guard your borders. Second is that for the most part, except for the UK, which was kind of always free trade oriented, you needed a big country to have a big economy so trade within your borders to keep up economic growth. So like the US has this big advantage. The US, until recently, was the biggest single economy in the world, and so it was good for us to trade with other places, but we're such a big place that we could handle a lot on our own. Scotland couldn't though, right? Scotland's not big enough to defend its borders. Scotland's not big enough to handle trade on its own if the UK blocked its borders. And then the last one is what economists would talk about, the ability of a country to respond to asymmetric shocks. Just like if a hurricane hits Florida, Florida doesn't have to handle that on its own. The parts of the US that aren't hit by hurricanes can help Florida. So asymmetric shocks are bad. It can also be deindustrialization or other stuff. And big states are better able to handle that by dispersing the risk. So those are the advantages of being big. The costs of being big are that you actually grow in heterogeneity, which is different kinds of preferences, right? You're pushing more types of people together, people that might have different preferences. And a lot of people who write about decentralization talk about how governments are more responsive at lower levels. They're actually, for the most part, not seen as always more effective or efficient, but more responsive, better able to do certain kinds of things at lower levels. And then the more important one, in my view, is conditions and preferences vary across these places. So Scotland, again, as an example, tends to be more left of center compared to England. England is more like they're fine with the austerity measures for the most part. Scotland is doubling down on free tuition, better healthcare, like they're expanding social benefits. How they're paying for it is a different issue, but conditions and preferences vary. So smaller countries can do things that only fit, like if we're making rules for our little group, we can do whatever we want, right? But if we add in like 60 more people, it becomes more complicated. That's the basic idea. So how big states are, is this big economics formal modeling debate, depends on these two, the benefits and the costs. Any questions about that? Okay. So how does the EU fit? The EU takes away those benefits a little bit for each one. So for one thing, it provides some degree of public goods, right? So it does handle, this is hard to say in this current climate because they're handling the crisis over refugees so poorly, but it's actually pretty good at handling certain kinds of public goods. It actually does distribute a lot of money to regions who are doing badly with the industrialization. Obviously handles monetary policy, trade negotiations. If you're a little country like Scotland, you don't want to negotiate with the US over anything, especially not trade. But the EU is bigger than the US and can at least hold its own negotiations. The second is the middle one, the trade, which is what economists care more about, is the market size. And for that, the EU is now a market size. And again, it provides some degrees of insurance. So the formal argument, the theory is all of these things mean that that balance on the previous page goes towards smaller states. That you can be smaller, you don't have to be as big. Obviously over here to the side, if you're interested in conflict resolution, NATO is also over here, taking away some of the advantages of being a big state, right? Because NATO handles the major defense, right? So that's a separate part of it. So economic integration should go hand in hand with political separatism. If you're interested in this, Alcina and Spoliari are the two economists who write about this the most formally. So they talk about actually globalization, broad globalization, but in fact European integration takes it a step further because it does all these other things. It reduces barriers to movement, labor, benefits, all these other things. And so what I wanted to do is just see if this part is true, right? If they do go hand in hand. So I look at whether or not regionalist, separatist movements are more likely to compete and more successful in elections. So I'll just kind of quickly go through this to wrap up my 30 minutes. These are the 8 countries where they compete, 7 countries where they compete. And the numbers are observations with regionalist parties, so each region is an observation. So Scotland in 2001 is an observation. Belgium, for anybody that knows Belgian politics, Belgium's a mess, totally different than other places because almost all the parties are regionalist. So you see 90% all the rest are before 1970 when they broke into the regional patterns. Denmark and Germany and France, parties only competed at 1 or 2 elections. Finland, Italy, mostly Lega Nord and the Swedish People's Party. Spain is more complicated, and the UK has Lake Timru, the Irish parties, and Wales and the Cornish. I've forgotten the Cornish party. They only competed in 1 election. So just as a reminder, I expect as cultural differences they're more likely to compete. It's simple. And as European integration goes forward, it's more likely to compete, right? If that theory's right, the viability theory, then this is the key implication. So I do a lot of different statistics. There's like a 30-page appendix in the back of the book that's just answering all the problems that come with these data. But this is just one key result, which is that as a measure of European integration goes up, you're more likely to see regionalist parties compete. The incidence is 0-1. So take each region, do they compete or not? Forget about how well they do, just do they compete or not? And that's a graphical representation of that same thing. It's basically as EU goes up, you're far more likely to compete. Now, you're never all that likely to compete, keep in mind, right? You're talking about going from 0.01% to 0.1%. I mean, you're talking about going from 1% to 10%. You're not talking about 100% chance or anything like that. And I'm happy to talk about the controls, any of the models, if that interests you all. The other one, again, so once they compete, how well do they do? Same thing, shows up strong, it's consistent across. This is only, the N on the other one was 2600, this is 345. This is just those regions where they compete. So if they get a 1 on the previous one, how well do they do? And I find that as the integration's gotten more, it does show up. Okay, so the kind of correlation doesn't help us understand whether or not my theory is right, but it does point evidence that the correlation's there. So why do I think the viability theory is the explainer? Like what helps me make sure that that correlation is happening because of what I say? If I'm on the right track, I'd expect these things. One is that, as I kind of told the story about the Scottish National Party earlier, the regionalists should start to use the language of the EU is our friend against the center. And they should, in general, support the EU. Not just support the EU, but support the EU because the EU makes the region more viable on its own, right? The Scottish National Party, for instance, they are very critical of the EU about fisheries policy. They're very critical about the EU about certain specific policies. But they really are pro-EU on this big, important issue. And the other thing I would expect, right, so it has to happen at the elite and the public level, I'd expect the regionalist public to support the EU, in part because the region is more viable as an independent state. So I expect it to change public attitudes about independence, about the viability of independence, about the likelihood that it would work, and their attitudes towards the EU. And I don't present those data here, but I have slides if you guys want to talk about those. Just closing up, don't get me wrong because I only talked about the EU. That is not the most important factor. The most important factors are those cultural, linguistic, and economic differences, right? Whether a region is richer or poorer than the others, whether it's culturally different. Those are the big drivers in these models where they compete. But the EU does play a role. And I think it's done a lot to change the way that elites in these regions can talk about independence, that it's a much more plausible thing than in the old autarkic world where each country would have to build its own system. That is it, 32 minutes left.